Hey guys, I'm Tyler, and today we are going to build this monitor stand out of cherry with waterfall sides. This video is sponsored by Rockler Woodworking and Hardware. Create with confidence. As some of you guys probably know, I am an engineer, so I spend a lot of time sitting at a desk working on a computer. And lately I've been trying to fix my posture in my workspace a little bit, and I wanted to raise the monitors of my computer up a little bit. So I figured what better way than to build something awesome that reminds me of being in the workshop while I'm at work. So this monitor stand is built out of cherry. It's got continuous grain all the way around. It waterfalls down around the corner. I got padauk dovetail splines that add a beautiful contrast to the wood. And then I left the live edge on the front, and it's covered in epoxy so it won't ever chip off. Before we get started, if you guys wouldn't mind hitting that subscribe button right there so you never miss when I upload a new video. So this is the cherry board before I started any of the build, and I got quite a bit of warp to it. I only have a section from about here to here that's actually usable. Originally I really wanted to use this board because it had some natural curve which would naturally go around my desk at work and display my monitors around me. But what I think I'm going to do, cut this into 3 different sections so I can get rid of most of that curve in this area and then plane it down, get everything to the dimensions that I need. Then I'm going to cut a slight angle between those pieces so that I can wrap the board around me. And I'm going to leave the live edge in place. The bark is on here pretty well, so hopefully it lasts through the milling process, and then I will epoxy that into place to make sure it's permanent. This project begins like so many before it at the miter saw station. I used the chop saw to cut down to approximate dimensions so that I had a better board to work with at the jointer and planer. This is the first time I've worked with some rough lumber like this that's been this warped, but now that I got it broken down, the pieces are actually relatively straight, so I'm just going to start with a little skip planing and then get these down to a 3/4 inch thick dimension. One of the best parts about woodworking is this transition right here. You got a dark age board going in, and you got beautiful grain in a different color coming out of your planer. Seeing that transition never gets old. I am actually using the jointer here to cut my pieces of wood to the proper width. Because I don't have an edge on the table saw to make this cut, I just ran it over the jointer several times. And here you can see that crazy transition in the cherry again. So cool. And now I am just laying out the pieces in what I think is the appropriate curve that I want to wrap my monitors around me in my workspace at work. Using a bevel gauge to get the dimension that I need to get that appropriate angle, and then using my table saw sled, which has an adjustable fence on it, and transferring that angle. I transfer the full angle and then divide it in half, because that angle actually has to be shared between the 2 different pieces of cherry once they're joined together to get that full angle. So the monitor stand is going to sit about 5 to 6 inches off of the desk surface, and it's going to be held up by these cherry legs that are cut from the ends of this piece so you get one continuous flowing grain all the way through. These are going to be held together with a miter and padauk dovetail splines. So let's go ahead to the table saw and cut this miter. We'll glue it together and then get the splines in. To make this miter look good, you need to make sure your table saw blade is perfectly 45 degrees so you have the perfect miter cut. I want to cut this in such a way that I lose the least amount of grain on the top as possible. I'm going to start with the miter side though, so I can cut it again if it's not quite right, and then I will cut it to the proper height after I get that miter just right. But again, I don't want to cut too much and lose the grain flow across that corner. The leg sections of the monitor stand were a piece of cake. Put it against the fence, cut it 45 degrees, move on to the next one. The tabletop itself was fine as well until I needed the bark side of the table against the fence. What I actually did to overcome this was use a framing square against the fence to square the piece up and then clamped it in place using some of the clamps that come with this Rockler sled. I'm going to glue the miters up before I join all of the board into one. The reason for that is I want a smaller piece to be able to handle over at the spline jig. Normally I would probably glue this all into one panel so it's nice and flat, and then I'll take it over to the spline jig. But in this case, I want to be able to handle the smaller piece over there, and then I can use my homemade mortising machine in such a way where I can still reference off the top and put my mortises in, and then I will flip it upside down when I do the glue up. Got my wet rag ready, and I'm going to use some fast acting CA glue to hold the miter in place as the wood glue dries. And this is so hopefully I don't have to clamp it. After I had the miters pretty well set in place, I did add a little bit of blue painter's tape to clamp everything in place and let them sit overnight to let the glue cure. Now over at the router table with a dovetail jig, I set up the jig to make sure I had the full width of movement that I needed for this larger tabletop. And then, just to prevent any tear out, I put a little bit more blue painter's tape on the piece and marked out where I wanted my cuts. These cuts were relatively easy to make. I would just suggest that you don't go too fast to prevent tear out, even though you have the blue tape on there to help with that already. Now that we have the dovetail grooves in the tabletop itself, it's time to make the dovetail splines. I'm going to use padauk like I mentioned before to get that beautiful contrast, and you actually use the same dovetail bit up against the fence to make the cut, as you can see right there, and you do both sides. It'll certainly take you a few tries to get it dialed in exactly where you want it, and I actually needed mine to be a little bit deeper than the bit was long, so I had to use a card scraper to scrape off that little bit of an edge, and then cut that dovetail off on the table saw. And because I needed it to be taller than my bit was, I sanded it on my oscillating spindle sander and then took it back to the card scraper to get it to the exact dimensions that I needed. Make sure you got a good fit with all your dovetail splines, and then apply a liberal amount of glue in the grooves themselves and on the splines, and glue your dovetails in place. And now it is time to join the tabletop together. So I marked where I want to put my loose mortise and tenons. I am going to be using my homemade cordless portable mortiser to make those cuts. You guys have dubbed this the Checker, and I think that is an awesome name. Tool works great, perfect for this application. Once you have the mortises cut and the dovetail splines are cured, it is time to cut them off and use a very low grit sandpaper carefully to sand them more or less flush, and then use a high grit sandpaper to sand them smooth with the rest of the piece. And now it is time for the glue up. At first I wasn't sure how I was going to accomplish this because the piece obviously is not straight, so you can't get clamping pressure all the way across, but what I did was actually clamp a bunch of clamps to the board and then clamp between those clamps, as you'll see in a little bit. Apply a liberal amount of glue to the piece and to the checkers, in this case, as we'll call them, and fit the piece together carefully because it will want to tip over on you here, and then add the clamps. Now is a great time to mention that if you guys don't have possibly the wood, the tools, or maybe the confidence to build something like this, you totally don't need to do fancy wood with dovetail splines. You can do pocket holes and plywood, achieve the same results, and build something that you are proud of. Originally I was trying to make this a two-legged stand, but that totally didn't work out. It wanted to tip over too much. So I cut a quick little leg to put in the back and glued it in place with some checkers. Because of the angles that I had to cut into the pieces to get the curvature that I wanted, some of the bark didn't line up, so I used the chisel to make it smooth around the front, and then gave the entire piece a good sanding, starting with a quarter sheet sander at 120 grit and then an orbital sander at 220 grit. To make sure that the live edge bark stays on for the duration that I have the piece at my workstation, I put down some blue painter's tape to prevent the epoxy from bleeding over onto the cherry, and then mixed up probably about 1/8 of a cup of Systems Epoxy. and I liberally brush that on using a cheap chip brush. To finish this piece, I am using General Finishes Armor Seal in a semi-gloss sheen. I applied a total of 4 coats, sanding with 600 grit sandpaper between coats 2 and 3. Well, there you go, guys. I absolutely love how this looks. I hope it does what I wanted to when it's in my workspace at work. I'm pretty sure I'm going to get a lot of questions about it, which is perfectly fine. I obviously love talking woodworking with people. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please hammer that thumbs up button. Hit that subscribe button right over there if you haven't already, so you never miss when I upload a new video. I'm DIYTyler. You guys have a good one.